Thank you very much for organizing this talk and for inviting me. So I'll speak on Yannarasa's critique of human rights between reactionary rejection of freedom, of modernity, and prophetic vision for a true political life. This paper will deal with the critique of human rights by Christos Yannaras, a modern Greek Orthodox philosopher and theologian. Yannaras's stance toward the category of individual human rights is a rather complex one and has been widely criticized by some scholars, such as Christina Stöckel, Aristotle Papanikolaou, and Pandelis Kalaizidis. My intention here is to engage Yannaras only in so much as he can serve as a case study in understanding how a critique of human rights is a part of a more general rejection of modernity within the Orthodox Church and beyond it. In his essay, Human Rights and the Orthodox Church, the Greek theologian rejects the modern conception of rights as inherently linked to the Western ideology of individualism. Yannaras implies that his rejection of rights is due not to the fact that he considers them to be inherently bad, but rather because this concept is, as it were, too primitive, or, as he says, pre-political. Let me illustrate this with the following quotation. We Orthodox acknowledge that the historical existence of such experiences as the Western Middle Ages proves that the protection of individual rights is a precious achievement. Nevertheless, we would be doing violence to the historical memory and critical thought if simultaneously we did not recognize that, compared to the ancient Greek city or the Byzantine and post-Byzantine community, the protection of human rights is a pre-political achievement. It is an achievement that has not yet fully attained, perhaps not even understood, the primordial and fundamental meaning of politics. Politics as a common exercise of life according to the truth. Politics constituted around the axis of ontology and not self-interested objectives. End of quotation. I propose that we can derive from this passage an important distinction inherent to Yannaras's argument, namely the dichotomy between the political and pre-political. This distinction implies that what Yannaras means by the political doesn't consist in anything in life that we would conventionally describe as a political life or community, but a very specific being according to the truth. In fact, Yannaras often contrasts the biological existence of man, defined by nature and individualistic, and his personal being, which springs out of man's freedom and which is realized in the polis. In this regard, there is an interesting parallel with Giorgio Agamben and his notion of bare life, nuda vita, and political life, drawn from the ancient Greek distinction between zoe, natural or biological existence, and vios, politically qualified life within the community. What Yannaras suggests is not that we should abandon human rights, but rather that we should consider them as a transitory step in the process, keeping in mind that the goal is life according to the truth. In fact, Yannaras's observation, I don't know how historically accurate it is, that there was no physical punishment in ancient Greece, suggests that he claims that the ancient Greece protected citizens in a manner not dissimilar to what is effectuated through the principle of individual human rights as we understand it in modernity. It is not my intention to defend Yannaras on the historical accuracy of his claims. My point is rather to show that his rejection of human rights is based on the presupposition that these are a low standard for a truly political life. Yannaras' rejection can be perhaps better illuminated by a comparison with a Russian Orthodox theologian Nicholas Afanasyev, and in particular with the letters ecclesiology and reflection on the place of law in the church. According to Afanasiev, law is foreign to church life, which is built on love and lives of grace. Afanasiev acknowledges the importance of law in what he calls empirical social life. He admires it as humanity's supreme achievement and recognizes the law it plays in protecting persons from each other and from the state. The law, however, belongs to the former age, while the church marks the beginning of the last days. Afanasiev should have listened to Professor Gabriel's paper in order to understand the confusion he is creating, but I'm going back to him. For the church, Afanasiev argues, a reality built on love and kenotic self-giving, to give up the law is to transcend it. One transcends an imperfect reality in order to seek perfection. Applying the logic of Afanasiev's argument to Yannarasa's treatment of human rights, I suggest that Yannaras rejects the category of human rights not as something inherently evil, but insofar as they are part of an approach which is transcended, raised to perfection by the true politics. Or, put another way, human rights are rejected as superfluous in a truly political community, not because they are bad, but because within the political life, which is life according to truth, there would be no place, no need to protect human dignity from violation. There is, however, an important difference between Yannaras and Afanasiev. According to the Russian theologian, law makes its appearance when reciprocal love among people has been weakened. Afanasiev does not seem to explicitly contemplate the possibility of the weakening of love within the church. However, his theology does allow for those who do not wish to live the Christian life of charismatic renunciation. Comparing Yannarasa's theology with that of Afanasiev, one is led to the conclusion that the former not only doesn't distinguish between ecclesiology and the political, but neither does he seem to contemplate a solution for those who refuse or feel it too demanding to live according to the truth. Jean Danielou, for example, faced with a similar problem, is much more realistic in his understanding that if Christianity wants to be a social endeavor or a civilization, it must include at the same time good and bad fish, leaving the discernment to the angels. Aristotle Papanikolaou, who approaches the issue from a different perspective, convincingly argues that, I quote, if the church relates to the world through persuasion, then in order to be consistent with itself, the church must accept a community distinct from its own. End of quotation. Yannaras is not clear as that. The question therefore remains, what to do with those who refuse to live according to the truth? Or to express this in terms more directly linked to the issue of holism, what to do with those who refuse to live the genuinely political life, as understood by Yannaras? I would conclude, therefore, that in the picture offered by Yannaras and those who contemplate similar ideas, there is no place for those who dissent. Now, it could be argued that it is very much a dissenter for whom human rights have been articulated. Yannaras is certainly right in denouncing extreme individualism of the modern age, which renders people, especially those who are sick and elderly, isolated and unrecognized in their dignity. However, what Yannaras fails to see is that human rights as a discourse are not only potentially capable of keeping people in isolation, but also, and foremost, they protect human beings from a system which is not immune to the risks of becoming totalitarian. In other words, they protect a peasant from the state. A further problem with Yannaras's critique of human rights is that it is logically inconsistent. In fact, in the picture offered by Yannaras, human rights appear to be a voice of an apolitical individual over against community. Now, it could be argued that the very acceptance of the human rights logic by the community renders it a communitarian discourse and not an individualistic one. This point can be made more explicit through a reference to Emil Durkheim. In Durkheim, the sacred is what belongs to a community, and the profane is something what is individualistic. Now, he also says that individualism is a religion of modernity. How can individualism become a religion? And Durkheim says it is a religion because it's accepted by the society. It is society that renders individual untouchable, in a sense, sacred. Applying Durkheimian logic to Yannaras, one could argue that the individual human rights theory, since it has been received and accepted by the society, ipso facto has become a social, non-individual matter. My further critique of Yannaras's approach to human rights is that it is an anti-Western in an idealistic and utopian way. By claiming that the East is communitarian while the West is individualistic, Yannaras constructs Eastern superiority vis-à-vis the West. In this case, however, such an outcome is accomplished through an ambiguous comparison of an idealized orthodoxy with the demonized West. Thus, both East and West can be said to be mythical. Brandon Gallagher, in his attempt to justify Yannaras's East-West dichotomy, presents the Yannaras narration as, I quote, a historical mythos of the fall of the West, rather than a historical interpretation or account of past events. The West stands for a sort of ontological cum spiritual virus, while the East and Hellenism represents a sort of ideal of a lost political, liturgical, and ontological paradise which inspires us to renew our world. End of quote. Gallagher's interpretation is very interesting. The difficulty here, however, is that, to say with Gallagher's metaphor, Yannaras sometimes presents his narrative as if the Greeks have been living in a direct continuity with the prelapsarian state and have never completely ceased to eat from the tree of life. Moreover, by describing the West as individualistic, Yannaras does not have another choice than to describe the East as communitarian, since what matters is not an objective description of the two realities, but their radical opposition. In this sense, the East is being conditioned by the image of the West. It is the mirror opposite image of the West. At the same time, however, what Yannaras's critique of our individualistic, anthropocentric society should not be dismissed too easily. To situate an individual human person at the center has its own dangers. Martha Nussbaum, for instance, points out how our anthropocentrism, based on a link between human dignity and rationality, I quote, involves a sharp distinction between human beings and other creatures. This spirit has encouraged the idea that we are free to treat animals as mere tools of our purposes. End quote. Contemporary understanding of the harm human activity causes to the planet and nature leads us to prudence regarding traditional understanding of human being as a center of the universe. As Jürgen Moltmann rightly suggests, human beings should move from the arrogance of cosmic dominion to the cosmic humility. On the other hand, a critique of human rights might come from a community perspective. And I think that this point is not completely absurd. The fact is that human beings do desire community. And as Zygmunt Bauman rightly points out, and I would like to end my paper with, by quoting him, this has its own price. I quote, "The really existing community where we do find ourselves in its grasp would demand stern obedience in exchange for the services it renders or promises to render. Do you want security? Give up your freedom. Do you want confidence? Do not trust anybody outside your community. Do you want mutual understanding? Don't speak to foreigners. There is a price to be paid for the privilege of being in community." and it is inoffensive or even invisible only as long as the community stays in the dream. The price is paid in the currency of freedom, variously called autonomy, right to self-assertion, or right to be yourself. The argument between security and freedom, and so the argument between community and individuality, is unlikely to be resolved, and so likely to go on for a long time to come, not finding the right solution. This will not prompt us to abandon the search, but to go on trying. End quote. I'm grateful to you for having spent this time with me trying to search for a solution.